I see is there's a gap between TRL 3 and 4 and TRL 7 and 8. It's like everything will die.
Just going to do a check as we get the webcast going. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good morning, and welcome to another Aspen Institute Cybersecurity Forum event. We appreciate the continued interest in this topic, and there's no wonder why. Increasingly, we rely on internet-connected digital information for not just the way we do commerce, not just the way we store information, but our physical lives and infrastructure as we move towards the Internet of Things. And yet we do so at this point keenly aware that we're relying on a protocol that was never designed with security foremost in mind. And as we currently take stock of the risks with decisions that we've already made, we're also aware that we're on the verge of a revolutionary change as we move towards the Internet of Things, where increasingly devices ranging from the pacemakers in our hearts to the cars on our roads to unmanned aerial UAVs, vehicles in the skies, are all relying in part on that technology. And it's increasingly prone to being disrupted. And we know, to put it bluntly, that currently with today's technology, despite the best efforts of some of the folks you'll be hearing from, that there is no internet-connected device that is safe from a dedicated adversary who wants to penetrate it. And increasingly that is true not only of a variety of nation states, but also sophisticated organized criminal groups. So, do we just give up and hide under a hole? Hopefully not. And today's panel is really some of the foremost experts in the field talking about, given that environment, how do you develop a culture of cybersecurity? How do you make yourself safer? The format today is going to start with opening remarks by Steve Grobman, who's the Chief Technology Officer currently at McAfee. He, unlike the rest of the panelists, has 24 patents in this field, reflecting his over 20 years of experience. And then we'll move towards a panel discussion, and we have with us today Congressman Will Hurd, who is the rare member of Congress who has actually worked technically on this issue in his background as a member of the Central Intelligence Agency. And he's been a leading light really on the Hill in terms of someone who understands the technology that's driving the policy decisions and has been bringing that expertise and perspective to try to use congressional both oversight and ability to pass legislation to change our culture when it comes around cybersecurity. And we also have with us Paul Abbate, who recently became the number 3 official at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is a longtime career agent who's been decorated for his work. I know I've worked with him over the years when he was focused on keeping us safe from terrorists, and prior to assuming this position, which includes having the task of keeping the FBI itself safe when it comes to cybersecurity, that prior to that, he was the lead executive who was over, along with the criminal and other divisions, but was over the cyber division. So please, let's give a warm welcome to our group today. And with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Hey, thanks, John. Good morning. While there's general agreement that cybersecurity poses a major risk, what's less clear is how we address this problem. It needs to be more than a technical response. It really needs to be that we need to impose a new culture of cybersecurity. It's not something that we can simply rely on IT organizations, on our CISOs, on our technology companies. It's something that needs to become really everyone's mission in order to understanding what they need to do in order to become part of securing our entire society from the modern risks that we now face. It's more than just creating a toolkit. It's really something that every citizen, it's also more than changing technology. And it's one of the things that I struggle with a lot because coming out of the technology industry, people often look to the technology industry for having some silver bullet and saying that if you were to just implement some new technology or look to government and say, if you could just change some policy, wouldn't that ultimately solve the cybersecurity problem? And it turns out that that's going to be woefully inadequate. We really need to fundamentally change the way that individuals think about cybersecurity, and it's really about changing the culture. And one of the things that I want to talk about this morning to kick us off is the ability to change culture is not impossible. It's been done before. Countries like Australia have implemented successful cultural shifts, such as having national anti-smoking campaigns. In the United States, we've completely changed the way that we think about things like airline safety, automotive safety. There's this term that we use that's called cultural capital, which analyzes the broad set of influences on how individuals, groups, society sees the world and reacts to it. And it's this cultural capital that comes from both immediate influences as well as individuals, folks that many people interact with, whether it's parents, peers, role models, mentors, neighbors, schools, the workplace, really together with wider society influencers, things like the economy, technology, and the media. Cultural capital does not in and of itself drive behavioral change. Others include things like individual motivators, along with the traditional policy vehicles that we all know well, whether it's legislation or regulation, incentives, information. Over time, it's focusing on these things that will really create us a new behavioral norm that will let people interpret this culture and attitude of having security first. We do need to recognize that cultural norms differ by group, by geography, by country. If we look at the cultural norm in Silicon Valley around innovation, the ability to fail as part of the innovation process is a well understood and part of the cultural norm. When an engineer builds an application or a device or an app and it doesn't work, that's not failure. That's part of the process to innovate. Whereas if you look at other parts of the world, any form of failure is seen as humiliation, and it really inhibits their ability to innovate because they're not willing to fail. Making sure that we can evolve the cultural norms in this country to think about security fundamentally differently is going to be incredibly important. And when we think about changing the attitude, we have to really think about what drives behavior. One of the things that we've assumed largely as a society up to this point is that rational choice is going to be the underlying driver for cybersecurity. We tell consumers, don't click on a link. Don't open an email unless you understand who it's from. Keep your software updated. As a technologist, these all make perfect sense to me. I understand why asking individuals to exhibit these behaviors is the right direction and what they need to do to minimize the risk and maximize the ability to be safe. What I've come to recognize, though, is all of society does not necessarily respond to rational choice as the most effective form of persuasion. We've learned from advertisers, psychologists, others in the industry that emotion is incredibly powerful. And we need to really understand from these experts what other tactics we might take. We need to understand that cyber criminals and bad actors, They're the masters of social engineering. They know that emotion can be one of the most powerful tools to get a user to do something that will ultimately lead to a cyber compromise. When a user gets an email that looks like it's a tracking record for a package they're not expecting, they don't say, well, I'm not expecting a package, so maybe I shouldn't click on this. They say, oh, is somebody sending me something that I'm not aware of? Let's see what this is. And they click on it, and as much as we tell them, they are engaging in what's ultimately risky behavior. We need to look at the large-scale campaigns that have worked in changing attitudes and really changing the behaviors around cultural norms in this country. Now, one example, going back in history a bit, is how we think about air safety. If you go back in time to the point where skyjackings were part of the norm, we had cases where in 1970, there were 24 skyjackings, despite the fact that skyjacking became a crime in 1961 after the Cuban Revolution. It really took behavioral methods by many people in the industry, as well as acceptance by society to change this. Things like having ticket counter agents look for suspicious behavior or nervousness. It really took the eventuality that a realistic threat of nuclear attack or accident forced the airline industry and the nation to make more drastic changes, to make things like passenger screening and bag screening accepted as a norm. If you think about following 9/11, the US federal government created the TSA, really the biggest startup at a federal level since World War II, imposing significant changes to the procedures involved in screening in flight. And because of the risks, passengers ultimately accepted the inconvenience in order to mitigate security. And I think looking to the airline industry as a model is a good start. If you think about what the airline industry does, they compete vigorously before planes fly in order to get a customer's business. Once the planes are in the air, every plane from any carrier will collaborate, will assist, will help any other plane in the sky in order to help with a safety or security matter that's in progress. It's that type of model and thought process that we really need to focus on. We also need to think about how can we take this message of security and turn it into something that the general public is able to comprehend. And for that, I think a lot about what the auto industry did very effectively over the last few decades in order to drastically reduce the number of injuries and deaths in automotive crashes. Government's been successful largely because it adopted a sophisticated and comprehensive approach that addressed safety issues across a number of areas. It was the drivers and passengers, it was the vehicles themselves, it was the physical environment, the highway system. Initiatives included things like establishing and enforcing speed limits, driving under the influence campaigns, and passenger safety restraints such as child seatbelts, airbags, among others. If you look at this campaign in a little bit more detail, the US seatbelt campaign was executed by both industry and government in the early 1960s. As studies started to reveal that the heavy impact of crashes on the human body, that many states passed legislation requiring seatbelts or seatbelt anchors in new cars, and it led to a national movement to really revolutionize auto safety when in 1966, Congress authorized the federal government to set safety standards for new cars, and in 1968, seatbelts, padded dashboards, and a few other safety features became mandatory. By 1979, all states had legislation requiring infants and young children to be restrained when traveling in passenger cars, and New York became the first state to enact a mandatory seatbelt law in December of 1984. It was after the enactment of the seatbelt laws that there were fewer crashes. The crashes that did happen were less severe, and the occupants required less medical treatment for things such as head and face injuries. Additionally, coalitions and organizations like the National Safety Council and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration took out ads to promote seatbelt use with slogans like, "It's a nice way to say I love you." Car companies took out similar ads. General Motors in 1982, which in a drive time radio ad promoted seatbelt safety with the tagline, "If a seatbelt is going to save your life, you have to give it a hand." The government aimed to make seatbelt safety ubiquitous, particularly as states created their own laws requiring the use of seatbelts. And perhaps the most influential element was the effort of the Click It or Ticket campaign, begun in North Carolina in 1993, which then spread nationally and came under the aegis of the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. The campaign relied heavily on advertising aimed at teens and young adults, and when a survey was conducted on how effective it was, 83% of 800 US citizens surveyed said they were aware of or had seen the campaign. It's really through this multi-pronged approach that Americans now view seatbelts and car safety as something that is part of society, something that a child can tell their parent that they need to put their seatbelt on when they're not wearing one. It's really become part of the culture. And if we use this map that the automobile industry has taught us on looking at some of the apt comparisons between the automotive industry and cybersecurity, both require a combination of technology and behavior to achieve safety. For instance, an excellent driver in an old car that's locking anti-lock brakes is going to create hazards, just as an impaired driver driving in a modern vehicle. You can look at the obvious parallels to the cybersecurity industry, where a well-trained team of cyber experts using outdated technology are not going to be effective at mitigating the threats that we face today, just at well-skilled operators who are using technology that is not configured correctly will pose similar challenges. But it's not just for the IT and security operators, it's also for consumers. A consumer cannot carelessly surf the dark web, go to suspicious sites, download content, and run it wantonly, even if they have a modern laptop that's fully patched with modern security software. There's still risks imposed. We need to have a culture of security that both appreciates the need for modern technology, but also the requirement that everyone throughout society have base levels of recognition of how to use that technology in order to create a society that can be safe and mitigate cyber risks. We need to take a cue from the automobile safety campaigns. A security-first campaign has to include technology, but technology is just one piece. Creating a culture of security requires research into what motivates behavior. We'll need funding, and we'll need relentless commitment. The Cyber Moonshot initiative the NSTAC is working on is an example of a sustained effort, beginning at the highest levels of government. Of course, the original Moonshot campaign in the 1960s was not just about technology. It affected hearts and minds. It had a strong emotional component, motivating Americans to reach the moon before the Russians. Americans had pride in their country. They believed in the power of science and in a young, charismatic president who spurred the sense of competition and told them anything was possible if they just put their minds to it. The campaign required focus, significant funding, and belief. Expertise and funding are essential for Cyber Moonshot to work, but so is behavior change and the emotional component that makes people want to achieve it. We have to have a concerted effort that focuses on a comprehensive approach to creating a culture of security through regulation, legislation, positive and negative incentives, and marketing campaigns. The time is right to dedicate resources and creative energy to a culture of security. In Washington, there's general agreement that overly prescriptive cybersecurity regulations have real limits, but there's also agreement that a lot more needs to be done to address our nation's cybersecurity challenges. Promoting and building a broad-based culture of security throughout our economy can be an important part of our nation's cybersecurity Get Well plan. The approach of changing beliefs and behaviors has worked in the past. It can work again. And with those opening remarks, I very much look forward to joining this amazingly talented panel. And John, thank you so much for moderating us.
Thank you, Steve, for those remarks. And it gives us a lot to chew on for the panel, and a lot of potential analogies to other industries. Let me start with. I remember when I was chief of staff to the then relatively anonymous Bob Mueller at the FBI, but I attended with him a memorial service that he went to each year for the victims of Pan Am 103, the Lockerbie bombing. And one of the things that stuck in my head from attending those events was hearing, quite movingly, a description of the recommendations that were made over the then deadliest plane terrorist attack that had happened in Europe about suggestions to improve aviation security. It was actually a panel and test led by a former President Reagan official. Almost none of those recommendations were actually adopted until after September 11th. And that's obviously a sector that is highly regulated, and great creativity and expense was taken after September 11th, when life was lost and perhaps a crisis that could have been averted if those recommendations had been put in place earlier occurred. As I listen to airline safety and cybersecurity, are there steps that we clearly should be taken before the cyber equivalent of a 9/11 occurs? And if so, and maybe I'll start with you, Congressman, what are they?
Well, I think there are some steps that we should take, basic things like there's not a national breach standard. So there's 47 different laws, state laws, that when the consumer's information actually gets stolen, and I think everybody would agree, the theft of a credit card, right? That's a bad thing, and the user should be notified. And a large company shouldn't have to determine what 47 different ways they have to notify a person, but also as an individual, as a consumer, I should know, as quickly as possible what information I have. That's a basic step. And trying to get a national breach standard has been difficult up here in Washington, D.C. It's the state law versus federal law. It's overreach by the federal government. If you have a standard, can someone go above that standard? What standard do you take? These are many of the conversations. I also think you're starting to have a broader conversation. If my tire blows out in my car because of faulty rubber, because it was made in the wrong way, guess who's on the hook for liability? The person that manufactured that wheel. Now, when it comes to the creation of software, you don't have that same kind of liability, and people are starting to ask those questions of how can we secure things like that. Everybody thought, hey, with the Internet of Things, let's not make the same mistakes with the Internet of Things that we made with the Internet. Let's think about security at the beginning, and I think most everybody would agree you shouldn't hard code a password into that device when you ship it, right? You should be able to update your software remotely, right? Now, if you want to be able to update your software remotely, what does that mean? That means on that widget, on that device, you have to have an operating system that can be updated. And so these were some of the conversations that were happening around the Internet of Things. So there's not consensus right now on what those basic standards should be, which is what's going to ultimately, I think, have to, unfortunately, there's going to have to be a major event that forces that. Some thought the Equifax breach was going to do that. It didn't. But I will say OPM focused a lot of people's attention on this issue, and the fact that so many folks understand what OPM is, and they recognize that breach, I think that has created a lot of folks and woke a lot of people in Congress up to these challenges.
Great. So if I'm hearing there are three potential areas, at least, of taking action. One would be uniform breach notification. Second would be exploring liability and increasing liability for those who are producing some of the products that are vulnerable. And then the third would be some type of standard setting for the new devices that are rolling out for the Internet of Things. But I think this is newsworthy and significant from where you sit. It doesn't look like we're going to make significant progress on any of those three, at least through Congress, unless we have an event that is not only major, but more major than some of the significant losses we've already seen when it comes to Office of Personnel Management and Equifax. And maybe with that, Paul, I'll ask you one question I have, and it's linked to what the congressman was referencing, is it doesn't seem like notification is accomplishing much right now when it goes to consumers. I think it was the former cyber czar when we had that position, Rob Joyce, who talked about the fact that he had been notified at least 8 times that his information had been taken. And so as a consumer, you're left with, well, what am I supposed to do with that information? What, from your perspective at the FBI, are there steps that should be taken to force notification to law enforcement or other government agencies rather than, or in addition to, consumers?
Thanks, John, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for having us here today. That's a huge challenge. It's something we struggle with every day. We do an enormous amount of outreach to the public, to the private sector, to encourage that notification when things go wrong and bad things happen. And we believe, based on the data that we have and the reporting that we have, that there's a vast amount of underreporting in that regard. So anything we can do to further drive that, to overcome that, so we have an accurate picture of what's out there, and we're getting the threat intelligence and information to act upon, learn from, and put ourselves in a better position going forward, is something that we would advocate for and be in favor of. We invest a lot of resources and time in terms of trying to achieve that in our realm, and that again goes to private sector outreach. We have a number of formal and informal groups towards that end, where we're trying to build those relationships with our private sector partners and reach out to the public to make them aware of the threats that are out there, educate them, and encourage people to come forward and let us know when a breach occurs or some other type of potential crime occurs, so that we can act upon it. So again, anything we can do to mandate or further encourage that, we would be in favor of that.
And John, can I add on to that? Look, I don't want Paul worrying about people putting credit card skimmers at the gas station, right? That's a local law enforcement thing. I want him to be able to focus on the Internet Research Agency. I want him to be able to focus on helping to defend against some of our nation state actors. So we have to make sure that our local law enforcement have the tools and understanding and resources to deal with some of these issues, especially when it's being generated from inside, or when the crime is being generated from inside our borders. And a lot of times, nobody knows where they're supposed to go when there's a problem, and they get flooded. My friends at the FBI get flooded with emails on that. So we have to increase the capabilities of our friends in local law enforcement to deal with some of these kind of breaches that are happening here in our borders.
Yeah, and hey, John, just building on that, I do think one of the things, Congressman, that you said that is interesting is a big difference between looking at the airline industry and cybersecurity is the technology is very different. So, in the airline industry, we have a few major airline manufacturers. We have a fairly low number of carriers, and it's a well-regulated industry. If you contrast that with the technology industry, basically there's no barrier to entry to building smart computed devices that attach to the internet, and there's no geographic boundary. So one of the big challenges we saw in the Maritime attack was it wasn't that they were devices from within the U.S. attacking U.S. machines. It
We have a
was
general audience. You want to just take one step back and explain what happened with Maritime?
Sure. So for folks that aren't familiar with Mirai, it was a attack where consumer electronics devices that had vulnerabilities became breached and essentially weaponized around the world and became part of a massive, what we call a botnet, essentially became weaponry for the attacker to then be targeted at specific locations. So in the case of the Mirai attack, they targeted this company called Dyn, which runs part of the critical infrastructure for Spotify, Twitter, some other major internet properties that everybody's familiar with. And what was interesting about this is it showed a situation where a consumer's device being breached didn't actually negatively impact the consumer, but it became part of the weaponry for the attacker to use against some other entity. And that's a very difficult problem to deal with, especially given the global nature of these devices.
And I want to follow up on something the Congressman said about reporting and the difference between reporting to state and locals and the federal government. A couple questions on that for you. One is, what's your view sitting at FBI on, I get this question all the time in private practice, where should I report information? So what's your view currently, and also should there be a Cyber 911? I know there was a project at the FBI, the Internet Crime Complaint Bureau, that really was set up in order to collect the information but then feed it back to state and locals. And when you're talking about a crime that might get reported in one jurisdiction, but the crook is likely to be in another jurisdiction, what's the right way to do a Cyber 911 so it's easy to report?
What you mentioned, IC3, that's a platform, a public reporting platform that we have out there now. It's a huge challenge, and it's not just in the cyber realm, but it's in crime reporting in general. That question of, where does one go and who do they go to for follow-up and investigation, justice, and so forth. There's no easy answer. It comes back to us in part in the law enforcement community to always work to better information share, build relationships, and cooperate with each other. We've taken steps within the IC3 framework to bring in our state and local partners within the context of our cyber task forces. Many of them have access. We offer access to all state and local law enforcement partners to IC3 so they can go in and grab the complaints and information that may be pertinent to their areas of jurisdiction at any time. And we also bring them into our task forces to work and take the state and local leads and share in that way too. It's like everything. We've got to continue to work on it. We've got to continue to get better at it, and we've got to work hard to develop those relationships, cooperation, and the information sharing. We want to always, of course, alongside our partners, encourage people, citizens, corporations to bring forward complaints when they have them, and then we'll work to sort that out and get it to to the right place, or whatever the origin of the complaint may be. I also wanted to mention on the Mirai botnet, we did at the end of 2017, we were able to identify, investigate, charge, and arrest the individuals that were responsible for that, and they pled guilty late last year. So we would always like to be on the front end of that and prevent something like that from happening. That's what we're working at each and every day. But when that doesn't happen, we are prepared to go out and hold responsible those people, perpetrators that conduct attacks like that. And we were able to successfully do it in that case. So thank you for highlighting that.
Awesome. One other thing that I would add, and I think it builds on both points related to reporting, is we need better agility in the definition of a breach. One of the problems that I see is a lot of the current state definitions for a data breach is data is stolen, where so many of the attacks that we're now seeing are things like ransomware, where a organization is having either data or systems held for ransom, and if they do pay that ransom, at least in many cases, they get access to the data or restoration of their systems, and it's unclear whether that constitutes a reportable breach if the data is not actually stolen. Congressman, I think one of the interesting points that you're making on the need for a centralized data breach regulation is not only the difficulty in having common elements that could ubiquitously be applied across the country, but also have a practical system that as we need to modify the definition for what a data breach is, we can do that centrally without having that debate in every state across the union.
Because is theft of information, we all get that. What about misuse of information? Right? And so these are some of the bigger problems. But when it comes to information sharing, I think we have an example of how to do this well, and I think it's the JTTF structure. Yes. And that's the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I believe that came after 9/11. I don't think that pre-existed. And I was in the CIA before 9/11 happened on September 12th, 2001. I was like the 4th employee in the unit that prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. If you would have told me then that would be 17 years before another major attack on our homeland, I would have said you were crazy, right? And the reason it hasn't been is because the men and women in the intelligence community, my friends in the FBI, keeping us safe, our military and local law enforcement. And so how do you recreate that structure when it comes to sharing cybersecurity information? And it's not just sharing across the federal government. You have to have the private sector involved in this as well. And I've always said that banks have a better idea of where the next set of malware is going to come. So let the banks turn those assumptions into collection priorities, task the NSA, the CIA, the FBI to collect on that, and then how do we get that information back in the hands of the private sector in order to better defend themselves? And that's the rhythm we should be able to get into. And you have these ISACs, the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers for different industries, but we have to bulk that up, and the federal government needs to rethink what is cyber intelligence, because cyber intelligence, I think, it perishes quicker than human intelligence, and so we have to stop. We got to be better. We got to be more prepared to act on cyber intelligence, and when you act on intelligence, oftentimes you lose that intelligence stream, and we just have to recognize that in this day and age, that's a reality.
That's great. So Morrison & Foerster now at a firm that we represent a lot of folks in the tech field, and there's still leftover trust issues. I know you yourself were an entrepreneur in that field. Congressman and Paul, you've been wrestling with some of those issues in your current perch. There was the Congressman just threw out a fascinating idea, which is, September 11th, the structures and changes, which both of you were a part of in government, took a phenomenal amount of money, time, organization, but it was all about sharing really fundamentally within government and between governments. This challenge is one step harder because it's sharing with and receiving information from the private sector and giving it back to the private sector. And the Congressman threw out the idea essentially of having intelligence priorities driven by the private sector, throughout banking sector as an example. What do you think of that, Paul, and where are we on it now?
Congressman, several great points, including that one. Just on the task force concept, the idea of the Joint Terrorism Task Force was actually, we had a couple of examples of that pre-9/11, but it was vastly expanded, and one was placed in every office post 9/11. We've tried in recent years with the emergence of the cyber threat, which really crosses all threat areas, to put in place a cyber task force in each and every one of our 56 field offices. But we're still in the early stages of building that out, and it does come back for our partner agencies to resourcing and the investment that needs to be made there. And I don't think that there's full recognition of that yet in the absolute commitment, which we're talking about here today, barring some catastrophe toward doing that. But we're well underway, and we have the framework in place reflecting the JTTFs to fully execute on that and bring it up to the capability that we like it on. As far as the cyber threat intelligence in the private sector, it's absolutely essential. It's everyone's problem. We have highly sensitive and classified information that we gain within government that needs to be shared with our private sector partners in some form or fashion as appropriate to put them in the best position to defend their information networks, et cetera. And the private sector owns the vast majority of networks in our country and infrastructure and the data. And as the Congressman pointed out, they are often at the forefront of identifying the malware, ransomware, and the indicators that we would need to fully inform each other. So we have some things in place already. We have a cyber intelligence center at within the intelligence community framework that was more recently stood up. That's one part of it from the interagency side. We have the NCFTA that we're expanding, which is a private sector public partnership that brings us together to share that information real time, but we can always do more. I like where we're at in terms of having the foundations of that in place, but we have to rapidly advance that, invest further into it, really commit to it all around to fully achieve everything that we can there.
But here's a problem Paul has. He can have those organizations. Congress can give him all the money he needs. There's not enough talented people to fill those spots. Right? If you just look at the federal government, there's 15,000 IT positions that are unfilled. That number in the private sector is even higher. The throughput or the pipeline is nowhere near it where it needs to be in order to have folks that have the talent in order to do these types of activities. So we have to do a better job earlier in people's education, making sure that they are conversant in basic, cyber tradecraft, how to use a computer, simple things. How does the internet actually work? How does an idea propagate? We learn how governments work, but we don't learn how something as important as the internet works when we're in middle school or elementary school. So making sure that we have the pipeline of people that can do these things that need to be done, because we just don't have enough bodies. We don't have enough talented people to do that.
That's a critical issue. Are there thoughts? What are a couple things we could do tomorrow that would start improving the pipeline of educated workers, but also, if I'm hearing you right, you're talking about both those in the field, but also a general awareness among everyone that would help with a culture of security?
So Steve gave an example about the whole spear phishing and how people are trying to get your information. So I'm like everybody else. I buy a lot of stuff on Amazon, right? And I have an apartment here in DC that I'm not in that often. I got an email from Amazon Hub saying, "You have a package." And I'm like, there's literally no one that knows my address up here that would be sending me a package, right? And so I took like 3 days trying to figure out, do we really have Amazon Hub in my apartment? Do we not, right? But a lot of people would just clicked on that and said, "Hey, I got a package."
Tying that with our other story, was there a place? So when you figured out, being the trained former Intel operative,
yeah, exactly. I'm getting slipped. It took me 3 days to figure out if there was an Amazon Hub in my apartment.
Where do you send that?
Well, there was an Amazon Hub in our apartment, and they're trying to entice me to get my password and do all that kind of stuff in order to force me and be like, oh, now I can buy more stuff, right? So in the end, it wasn't a spear phishing operation, but I'm suspicious. I'm always suspicious. So what can we do? Introduce coding into middle schools. Right? We've been working with a company called Bootstrap that helps train algebra teachers to introduce coding into algebra class. So 7th and 8th graders get exposed to it. So if we expose people to the basics of coding, maybe they will get focused on this as a career. You have the Cyber Patriot program that happens in a lot of high schools and even in middle schools, where it's basically you get a bunch of kids hacking each other, and usually whoever wins ends up, the entire team gets almost 6-figure contracts to go work at big companies, right? So just starting that and exposing people at an earlier age. I also think we got to figure out how we start teaching how this new economy, how this new thing, how it works from the foundation. Do you introduce that into a political science class? Do you introduce that into a history class where that's one of the sections? I think that's some very basic, if you have a basic understanding of this. And then also, this isn't a pure cybersecurity problem, but when it comes to disinformation and covert influence, what the Russians were trying to do in our elections in 2016, don't share stuff if you don't know the sourcing of it, right? Now, I'm a little critical as a former intelligence officer, but we all know as kids, don't get into a car with a stranger, right? And I would say you got to put an asterisk on that now, just in case, unless it's an Uber or Lyft driver. Right? But why are we sharing information from somebody that we don't know who they are or where the information came from? So that's not a hardcore cybersecurity issue, a challenge, but it's part of this broader disinformation efforts that are targeting against us that we have to prepare ourselves for.
Yeah, and I'd add on a few things to that. I mean, I think number one, recognizing that it's not just about getting people into the cybersecurity field, but getting a better level of baseline knowledge across the population. And from a pipeline perspective, if you think about all of the courses that are taught as part of a general curriculum, everybody generally takes calculus. Like, how many of us actually use calculus in our, I'm not saying stop teaching calculus, so to be clear, but like at least having some baseline.
I think you could run for office on the stop teaching calculus
Yeah,
platform,
maybe.
but
I'm
probably
not going to
a
run
good
for office
idea.
anything. But, having
I just want to make it clear, I'm pro-calculus.
Okay, pro-calculus.
Yeah.
But having a base level of cybersecurity knowledge as part of a general curriculum is key. And I think also making sure that people understand why cybersecurity is an amazing field to get into. I mean, I can tell you why I love cybersecurity. It's a field that forces you to constantly learn. So if you want a job where you have to learn new technologies every few months in order to be effective in your job, cybersecurity is a great field to go into. And you can contrast that with many other fields. If you're a civil engineer, the principles we build bridges with are basically the same principles we built bridges with 100 years ago. Statics and dynamics don't really change that quick. That's not the case with cybersecurity. And I think having the mindset that cybersecurity is not, the male in the hoodie, in the basement, and unless you're that, stereotype, the field is not for you. It's really a field that all sorts of individuals could be extremely successful in.
And maybe, Paul, you now have the task of filling that pipeline when it comes to the FBI, unless there's been a restructure. I think you're, when it comes to training and hiring, that falls within your remit. How are you, where's the FBI on this right now, and what type of efforts or steps are you taking internally to try to train and hire up?
It's obviously a major challenge, as we've already talked about up here, and we're hyper-focused on that. I hate to say this, but we're focused in the short term right now. We're trying to go out as we're in a competition with other government agencies and the private sector to bring in that cyber skilled talent with the right expertise to do the work that needs to be done in that field and counter the threat. And we're all struggling with that. For us, it's still selling the mission, people wanting to come in and do the right thing, serve the nation, protect people, keep people safe, and the satisfaction that comes with doing that job. Well, that's our main selling point for attracting any kind of person to the job, including those that have those skills. we've got a number of initiatives targeted to go out to certain, higher level academic institutions, colleges and universities, and talk with people like that, interest them in our agency and the work that we do, and bring them in the broadest sense, like the congressman said, it needs to be, it's a societal problem and a challenge for our country that needs to be built in to the education system at all levels, so that we can get there where we need to be. But we are implementing, as I said, measures within the FBI to go out right now and get the people that we need to do the job right now and to protect the country and our citizens. We are stretching a bit. We're even going into the high school level. We've implemented what I think is a really novel approach in some of our field offices that we're expanding, where we've reached out to high schools and partnered them with universities that are focused in the areas of cybersecurity and related fields, and marrying them up and trying to make contact with students at the high school level and form programs between the high school and the universities that bring that together and provide a pathway and a flow through for them to go from the high school to that university through the program. We provide some level of funding toward their education to encourage them to do that. And then ultimately, we're hoping, we haven't seen the outcome yet because we've only recently implemented this, that they would move through those programs from the high school level through the college and university, and then ultimately into government, specifically with the FBI, bringing those skills with them so that they can work in our cyber squads and task forces and have the skills, knowledge, experience, and expertise they need to actually effectively do the job.
How does that marry up with a push to increase diversity, which you also oversee and touched on? Yeah.
Yeah, diversity is another huge challenge that we face, not just in our organization, but across government and in the private sector. Likewise, we've got focused initiative and programs toward that end. We're going out to certain colleges, universities, communities to attract and interest people from diverse backgrounds toward our agency and the work, and bring them in. It's been effective. It's something where we're certainly lagging based on the numbers and the data that we have. But I'm encouraged because we've seen in recent classes, through those efforts, through our diversity agent recruiting program, we have seen an increasing diversity within the new agent and new analyst classes that we're currently putting through, and have seen over the last maybe year to two. So, we hope that continues and bears out, and ultimately we'll have an organization that's better representative of the communities that we serve in the future. But we've got to maintain that, and we're really committed to doing that. We take it seriously.
Part of it might also be about making it clear to the general public what the mission of cybersecurity is really all about. It's about keeping consumers, organizations, nations safe. And when people recognize that the profession is about creating benevolence in safety for critical things that they care about, it becomes more appealing to a much more diverse set of individuals. At McAfee, every employee signs a pledge. And it's not a pledge to the company. It's a pledge that basically says, as a cybersecurity professional, I will work to protect the security of individuals, organizations, and our nations. And it's getting that mindset across, that it's more than just being in a highly technical field, that you're doing something that creates a tremendous benefit to society. And I think that'll help a lot as well.
Well, you were touching on this a little bit. So that's in the cybersecurity space. How do you broaden that mindset out so it's not just in cybersecurity, but those who code the video cameras that people put up as baby monitors that then get turned into something like Maritime, or those who are just consumers on figuring out when and how to use passwords and the like?
So for my generation, if you didn't know how to type, right, you're not going to get a job, right? Like every job required an ability to type. So I'm assuming they're still doing Mavis Beacon in schools, but how do you broaden that course to be a computer literacy, right? To understand how everything's connected. The number of interconnected devices that we're going to see in the next 10 years is ridiculous. What that number is, a couple billion. So that means our surface area of attack is going to increase, meaning the more ways bad guys can get, or bad girls can get access. Well, actually, it's probably going to be bad artificial intelligence, being able to get information on me. So people, that's that common body of knowledge to understand these tools that you're using. When you learn how to drive a car, you learn about the weaknesses of the vehicle, how you can get hurt, things like that. And so, where should we be doing that? Maybe it's typing class, maybe it's something, I don't know.
I do think, John, like there is an interesting problem that we can't ignore, which is, especially in consumer electronics devices, there are not incentives for good coding practices. So if you think about consumer buying behavior, consumers are not going, either to Amazon or to a brick and mortar store and looking at the line of TVs and saying, which one of these suppliers has a high quality coding practice in their environment that will mitigate the risk of me having a cyber attack inside my house. Like that is not the thought process. They're looking at the, probably price, they're looking at features. And until we can actually have part of the culture be, just as you think about what is the quality of this device, will this device break? And also think about, is this a company I actually trust? That I think they have invested in things that will lower the risk around cyber attacks. That's critical. I also think the other challenge is the global nature of it. So even if we were to impose more rigorous standards for devices that were built within the United States, that's not where a lot of the technology is designed and manufactured. And I don't know that there's easy questions to deal with those problems.
Let me. We're going to open up to questions from the audience in a second. Let me do one final one before we do. So when I was a kid growing up in a city, Officer Friendly used to come by to school, and part of the lesson was don't make eye contact. When you're walking down the street, that's what's safe. If you see something suspicious, cross to the other side of the street. And I think ultimately we've decided that wasn't really the solution to lowering crime rates in the city. Nowadays, when it comes to cybersecurity, you hear you should have a different 10-digit alphanumeric password for every system that you use online. So you should remember, and don't write it down because that could be compromised. So you need to remember 12 to 14 different 10-digit alphanumerics. I don't know that humans are really are ultimately going to be able to do that. Where should we be moving when it comes with better ways to authenticate that you are you when you're using a service online?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's a two-phased approach. I think for the world we live in today, we need to recognize what the limitations are and give practical advice. So, I think we need to look at the risk of writing down unique passwords, as opposed to using the same password in multiple places. By writing it down is less risky. It's not perfect, but it's something that people shouldn't be as concerned to do. I think in the longer term, there's absolutely the technology to move to better authentication systems where we can use a single party to do authentication to a user and then assert that authentication to other entities. Folks that have used either Facebook or Google authentication in order to sign into another site, that's kind of what's going on behind the scenes. And moving to that sort of approach in scale is some of the things that we can do, as well as we'll have the debates on biometrics as opposed to multi-factor token authentication. But there's things that we need to get people to do right now because the world we live in is still a password world.
Look, we got to rely on the private sector to come up with those good ideas. There's a company now that based on, they can authenticate, access to your phone based on how you use your phone. Like not the applications you use, but the way you hold it, the degree you use it, how, which hand you use it with, how often, those kinds of things which I never would have, I would never have come up with that as an idea. But authentication is an important thing of how we get access to our information, but also authentication of attacks is another thing that we have to ultimately get better on so that we can attribute attacks and then make sure that we apply consequences to those people that are doing that.
All right, let's with that open it up to some questions. Sir.
Hi, I'm Tim Johnson with McClatchy Newspapers. There's a bill in Congress, if I understand correctly, that would codify an Office of Biometric Identification at DHS. Can the federal government keep biometric information safe? Is this a good idea to have one repository of all this biometric information?
I'll start. I'm unfamiliar with the bill, which leads me to believe it's probably not going anywhere, right? So that would be my first step. Look, is there a way? Is there anything? There's no such thing as impenetrable information or data, or an impenetrable machine or device. And so, are we doing enough to protect that kind of information? If we can't get it right on OPM, are we going to be able to get it right on that? So I would have some suspicion on our ability to keep that kind of stuff safe, and whether we even need to have it.
Eric.
Eric Geller from Politico. Yesterday, the FBI acknowledged that there were some problems with the way they collected statistics about the going dark threat. The number was inflated by perhaps as much as 2 or 3 times the actual count. So, Mr. Abbate, you're part of Director Wright's leadership team. I know the FBI is working on the methodology, but he cited the statistic, I think it was 7,800 devices last year, many times in pressing for a solution to this debate. How is he personally responding to the news that the number he and others have been citing is essentially highly inflated? And what is he planning to do to restore the Bureau's credibility on discussing this issue? And then Congressman Hurd, there have been calls from civil liberties groups for the Justice Department Inspector General to open an investigation into this and for the judiciary committees in Congress to look into it. Do you support those calls?
So as you pointed out, we did issue a statement yesterday regarding the calculation errors that have been detected. It's a computational error that our team, the team that works on this area, found just very recently. We brought it forward. We take it seriously. We have an internal team taking on an in-depth review of this right now so that we can refine and get the numbers right, and that we can implement a methodology going forward to capture and address a complicated problem that we all face.
Look, the fact that the FBI came forward with these errors, and that they're trying to correct it and getting new information back, let's see where that goes before the need of some kind of special investigation. This is a broader issue, the issue of going dark, that I think the private sector and federal law enforcement, we need to be working together in order to figure out how do we defend our digital infrastructure, chase bad guys, and protect our civil liberties all at the same time. We can do that. It's hard, but part of that is ensuring that not just federal law enforcement knows what information is already out there and that they can get access to. It's making sure our local law enforcement understand that as well too.
Hi, David Winks with AccuSite. Just a question for the congressman. A lot of foreign states seem to be combining cyber with electronic warfare. Is there some way that Congress can help the public utility commissions refocus from simply lowest cost provision of services to more reliable provision of services so that companies and industry can do cost recovery?
Well, I would say that the utilities sector is a key to their sector is reliability and redundancy, and so I think that's an important element that utility providers across the country are already doing, and I would agree with you. We talk about cybersecurity. But there's a broader issue of electronic warfare and what will the Russians or the Chinese ultimately try to do if they were going to impact us, and one is turning off the lights. And guess what? This is no longer a theoretical exercise because the Russians did it to Ukraine a couple of years ago, and it was only until recently that we applied consequences for that kind of behavior. But it can go even broader. Why are the Chinese trying to become the world's leader in rail cars? Right? Because rail cars crisscross our infrastructure across the United States, and they're going to have all kinds of sensors, and they're going to understand how we move product, we move our military. So we need to. I think we should be using our latest and greatest counter-electronic warfare in places like Eastern Ukraine, because the Russians are using their training on their electronic warfare personnel in Eastern Ukraine. So we should be doing the opposite. We should be working with our allies like the Ukrainians. But financial services, I would probably say the industry that is probably the most sophisticated when it comes to defending their digital infrastructure. Number two is utilities. And this is something that I know our utilities sector takes very seriously. And Department of Homeland Security is working with, how do you improve sharing with that sector to ensure that our grid is protected.
Thank you very much, Larry Checo Communications. I took three main messages from all of this. It's technology, culture, and messaging. Technology, I know nothing about. Messaging, I know something about. Culture, I know something about. Messaging, I know a lot about. What would be a good way to put in the hands of consumers, every time they buy a computer or an electric device, a list of the 10 best practices to protect yourself on these? Well, it seems to me that's a no-brainer. Even my grandmother probably could understand it if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, it's this to your point. It's messaging. You got to get the message out, and from a reliable source. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one quick point I would make is in 2018, it's not just when you buy a computer. Cybersecurity is in every device that's around us. Our cars are smart and connected. Our mobile devices are smart and connected. The things that run, I probably have 35 smart connected IoT devices in my house. So when we think about cybersecurity, it needs to be part of our life. And I don't think it's going to be as simple as a checklist. And unfortunately, the first step is recognizing there is some complexity to the topic. But I think the best analogy I could give is it's a little bit like managing your health. There's a lot of things that you need to be aware of. There's lots of different diseases, disorders, but you can take some basic steps to try to stay healthy. And I think that's the mindset the general public might be able to comprehend.
What is the equivalent of click it or ticket, right? Nobody has made that. And so all the attacks we've talked about, we can defend against over 85% of them if we have a password that's over 14 characters, John.
Just not your social security number.
Yeah, we patch your software. Don't click on an email from someone that's coming that you don't know where it's coming from. So when after I got out of the CIA, I helped start a cybersecurity company, and we would do technical, would do vulnerability testing, penetration testing, technical vulnerability assessments, and we would oftentimes do a spear phishing exercise with the workforce, right? When I was in the cyber business, we always got in. And there was one time we almost didn't get in, and we resorted to spear phishing, and guess what? Lo and behold, somebody clicked on our emails. So one of the things that we saw in companies where they improved their email hygiene was we sent them a message. After they clicked on something they weren't supposed to click on, we sent that individual a message and said, you clicked on bad information. And then we aggregated these numbers and sent it out to the entire workforce. So we didn't technically name and shame, right? But we got pretty close. And when you saw that done over time in the same business, you saw the number of people clicking on bad information drop significantly. So I think at the workplace is one area where we can hit folks, now to try to change that and get that message that, click it or get shamed. Maybe that doesn't have the same ring as click it or ticket, but
Maybe don't click it.
yeah, don't click. Yeah, exactly.
And one here.
Click it.
Dustin Volz with Wall Street Journal. I just want to follow up on the question posed earlier about the going dark news that we heard yesterday. Does the FBI know, or is it accurate that the not just the 2017 numbers are erroneous due to a computational issue, but are years prior to that, the data that we saw before that also being looked at, and are they also erroneous? And a follow-up to that, Director Wray and others have used the 7,800 number figure over this past 6 months or so to really illustrate this issue as a singular data point, showing that it's a pressing problem that needs to be resolved. If the new data, the accurate data comes back and the numbers are substantially lower, is this going to in any way cause the FBI to reevaluate or reconsider its approach to the going dark issue? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The methodology that was found to be flawed was implemented in about April of 2016. I think that reflects what the statement said. So, but we're looking all the way back. I look forward to sharing with you the right numbers once we have that count based on the work that the team is going to do, and putting that out to you all. What was the second part of your question?
If the new numbers are substantially lower, is this going to change the way that the FBI approaches this issue? Because this has been a singular data point used by the director and others to illustrate it as a problem.
Underlying it all, we still think it's a major problem, the going dark issue. There is going to be some number of devices that we in the FBI and law enforcement were unable to access, though we had lawful authority to do so. And whatever that number is, and as I said, we'll share it with you all once we have the right and accurate number. Each one of those devices represents a potential terrorist attack that could have been prevented, or a child that could have been protected from a predator, or an act of violence that could have been prevented across a range of issues. So we still think it's a critical and serious problem, and something that we're going to have to continue to deal with going forward. You're welcome.
Okay. This will be our last question.
My name is Tony Spadaro. I'm not a reporter. We've heard some really interesting stuff today about the need to change behaviors of both individuals and organizations, and some very creative ideas about how to increase this cooperation between breach notifications and threat sharing and solution sharing. Now for the elephant in the room. How do we achieve that with the presence of both internal U.S. and foreign efforts to specifically erode the trust that we have in our law enforcement and our intelligence agencies?
Well, that presupposes that there's a coordinated effort, right, to undergird this. I think we need to be holding our federal law enforcement and intelligence services to high standards, but we also need to be supporting them. As a proud member of the intelligence community, I recognize the difficult tasks that are my friends in both the CIA, the Bureau, and the NSA ultimately has. Some are saying we're living in a post-facts world. For me, my dad always taught me, be honest, treat people with respect. We can't do this by ourselves. I think we have to work closer with our allies across the world on this issue. They're all dealing with it. Some of them have been dealing with it longer than we have, and I use Estonia and Georgia, Ukraine as examples. They've been able to deal with this threat, and I think it starts with a recognition of the actual problem. I know this is something that I'm focused on, and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are trying to do to make sure that we keep people safe. And I would say that cybersecurity and with that IT procurement, those are actually some of the last few real bipartisan issues in Congress. These are issues that I spend a whole lot of time working on, and we do it in an incredibly bipartisan, I would even say nonpartisan way. And so I'm going to continue to do that.
Final thought on that, Paul?
Just, we're going to continue to keep our heads down, do the work, focus on the mission. We're going to do it well, thoroughly, rigorously, and work 24/7 to keep this country and our citizens safe. Period. I think the work speaks for itself. And when mistakes are made, we're going to study that, we're going to learn from it, and we're going to get better from it. And if people need to be held accountable, we're going to do that as well. Period. And we're going to move forward.
I want to end with a shameless plug and then thank the Aspen Institute cyber program that we've started. I think you can see why from today's discussion. There is much to be done in this space, and then in particular it needs to work across the government, private sector, both executive and congressional branches. And I want to call your attention to one program and thank Congressman Will Hurd for being a co-chair of a group that's working on nonpartisan solutions, that's also led by President Obama's former Homeland Advisor, Lisa Monaco, and the CEO of IBM, Ginni Rometty. So I thank those of you who have supported that effort, the Congressman for the time he's put into that effort, and then to all of our panelists today, both for taking the time to address these issues today, and also because I know each of you in your daily lives are trying to help keep us safe when it comes to cybersecurity. So thank you.